but all of them alert, ready to see justice play out. When Karen walked in, late as usual, she carried herself like she still owned the place, heels clicking on the tile, a stack of folders clutched to her chest, her eyes scanning the room for allies, but the only response she got was a cold silence that made her cheeks flush crimson. The interim board opened the meeting by reading the audit findings, and the results were devastating for Karen. The documents showed thousands of dollars in padded invoices funneled to her husband's company, unexplained withdrawals from the HOA account, and fines issued without proper votes or quorum. Gasps rippled through the room as page after page was read aloud, each one a nail in the coffin of her credibility. I could see her shifting in her seat, gripping the edges of her folder so tightly her knuckles turned white, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she could will the words away. When the board finished, they announced their recommendation: restitution be calculated for every improperly fined resident, contracts tied to Karen's husband be voided immediately, and all future financial decisions be subject to independent audit. The room erupted in applause, neighbors cheering, clapping, some even whistling, and Karen's composure cracked as she stood, gavel-less but still desperate to assert control, shouting that the audit was biased, that I had manipulated the board, that this was nothing but a witch hunt. That was my cue. I rose slowly, binder in hand, and walked to the front of the room. The crowd hushed, all eyes on me as I laid the binder on the table and addressed the board, not with anger but with calm, deliberate clarity. I reminded everyone of the master key incident, the broken brass piece still sitting in an evidence bag at the sheriff's office, proof of the line she had crossed. I recounted the retaliatory fines, the bogus inspections, the restraining order she had filed and lost, each example painting a picture of abuse not in broad strokes but in precise, undeniable detail. Then I presented the easement documents once more, explaining how the office building itself rested on land tangled in rights that the HOA did not fully control, and how I had filed the proper paperwork to assert those rights. The room was silent except for the turning of pages and the occasional gasp as I read aloud clauses from the deeds and easement agreements. Karen tried to interrupt, but this time the crowd itself turned on her, shushing her, shouting her down, demanding she let me finish. Her power, once absolute, now lay shattered at the feet of the very people she had ruled through fear. I ended my presentation with the proposal I had been building toward for weeks. I told the board and the residents that the HOA office, once a symbol of control and intimidation, should be repurposed into something transparent, accountable, and beneficial for the entire community. I offered to oversee the transition as a temporary custodian, ensuring records were preserved, restitution calculated, and access granted only under lawful procedures, with full transparency to the residents. It wasn't about me holding power, it was about proving that the office could serve the people rather than rule over them. The proposal was met with a wave of applause, louder than before, and several neighbors stood to voice their support, including some who had once remained silent out of fear of Karen's retaliation. One by one, voices rose from the crowd, affirming their desire for change, and when the interim board finally called for a vote, the result was overwhelming. The community approved the transfer of the office to my custodianship, pending the resolution of the easement dispute. Karen's scream of protest was so shrill it cut through the cheers like a knife. She stormed down the aisle, waving her folders, shouting that this was illegal, that I was staging a coup, that property values would collapse without her experienced leadership. Her words fell flat, drowned out by boos and laughter, and when she tried to storm the front table to snatch the microphone, 2 deputies who had been quietly stationed near the back stepped forward, blocking her path. The sight of uniformed officers shaking their heads as she fumed and sputtered was the final humiliation, and she crumbled, dropping her folders to the floor, papers scattering across the tile as the crowd watched in silence. She bent to scoop them up, hands trembling, but the damage was done, her authority was gone, her dignity in tatters, and her downfall complete. The board recorded the vote, the deputies escorted Karen out, and for the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to the residents rather than a tyrant. After the meeting adjourned, people lingered, talking excitedly about the future, some even hugging me, others shaking my hand, thanking me not just for standing up but for doing it the right way, by the book, without stooping to Karen's level. It was a surreal moment, standing in that hall surrounded by neighbors who now saw me not just as the man who lived in the cabin by the lake but as the one who had wrestled back their community from the clutches of corruption. Yet even as I soaked in the moment, I knew the war wasn't fully over because Karen was too stubborn to simply vanish, and her threats of lawsuits and appeals still loomed in the background. But the balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and now she would be the one scrambling, while I held the office keys, the bylaws, and the community's trust. Back at my cabin that night, I set the binder on the table and poured myself a drink, staring out at the moonlit lake with a mix of relief and anticipation. The battle had been fierce, but it wasn't just about personal victory, it was about proving that one person armed with truth and persistence could topple an empire of lies and intimidation. The office was mine to steward now, not through brute force or trickery but through patience, law, and the will of the people. The weeks after the decisive meeting felt almost like living in a different place entirely because the constant tension that had hung over the community like a storm cloud was gone. Neighbors no longer avoided eye contact in fear of being reported and instead waved cheerfully, stopping to chat about gardens, fishing, or plans for the weekend. Yet beneath that new calm I kept my guard up because I knew Karen wasn't the type to vanish quietly. And sure enough, she began clawing back in the only ways she could, through threats of lawsuits and endless appeals to anyone who would listen. I received thick envelopes stuffed with papers from her attorney, claiming the recall election was invalid, that the transfer of the office into my custodianship was unlawful, and that she remained the duly elected president. Each letter was filled with bold accusations and hollow threats, but instead of rattling me they only fueled my determination because I had anticipated every angle of attack and built defenses long before she launched them. I gathered the notices, logged them in my binder, and responded through the proper channels with precision, quoting statutes and attaching certified documents until her filings were reduced to dust under the weight of my preparation. It was a battle of attrition, and she was burning through money she didn't have on attorneys who quickly realized she had no case. At the same time, I focused on solidifying the community's trust because the true key to holding power wasn't paperwork alone, it was the will of the residents, and so I organized open forums where neighbors could ask questions about the audit, the restitution process, and the future of the HOA. We held them in borrowed spaces at first, the library, the firehouse meeting room, but soon the topic of the shuttered HOA office arose, and people wanted to know when it would reopen and who would control it. That was the moment I revealed the easement clause in full detail, explaining how the land under the office had been tied to overlapping rights since the 70s and how I had secured my position legally by filing the proper notices. Some residents gasped at the revelation, others laughed in disbelief that Karen had sat in a throne she didn't fully own, but all of them understood now why her grip had slipped so completely. I assured them that once the dust settled, the office would reopen as a transparent community hub, a place where meetings were recorded, finances were posted publicly, and no one feared a knock on their door in the middle of the night from someone wielding a so-called master key. Karen tried to rally her last loyalists, a handful of board members who had benefited from her reign, but even they began peeling away as the evidence mounted. One of them secretly called me, admitting that Karen had pressured him into signing blank checks she later filled in for security expenses. He gave me copies, notarized them, and handed them over like a man confessing to a crime he had long regretted. Another board member resigned publicly, writing a letter to the residents apologizing for enabling Karen's corruption and endorsing my efforts to restore fairness. With each defection, Karen's circle grew smaller, her shouts more desperate, until she was little more than a loud echo bouncing off empty walls. Then came her last desperate gambit. One Friday morning, as the community gathered for a clean-up day at the lake, Karen appeared with a locksmith in tow, waving what she claimed was a court order granting her access to the HOA office. Neighbors froze, shocked at her audacity, but when I stepped forward and asked to see the document, it turned out to be nothing more than a poorly drafted letter from her attorney, unsigned by any judge. The locksmith hesitated, unsure, and when I calmly presented my certified easement filing along with the sheriff's advisory confirming Karen had no authority, the locksmith packed up his tools and left without turning a screw. Karen's face turned crimson, her voice shaking as she shouted that I had stolen everything from her, but this time the crowd didn't shrink back in fear, they laughed. The sound of dozens of voices laughing at her was worse than any gavel strike or fine notice, and she broke down, screaming incoherently before fleeing in her car, tires screeching on the gravel as dust clouded behind her. That moment was the true end of her reign, because humiliation in front of the very people she once ruled left her with nothing but bitterness. With Karen finally neutralized, the community moved to formalize the transition of the office. The interim board voted unanimously to sign over custodianship of the property and records to me, pending a new election that would establish a fair and transparent leadership. I accepted, but with conditions: every meeting would be open, minutes published, finances audited by an independent third party, and key control restricted to documented, lawful purposes only. The applause that followed was not just for me but for the idea that the HOA would no longer be a weapon wielded by one person, but a system accountable to everyone. In that moment, I wasn't just a cabin owner fighting off harassment, I was a custodian of a new era for the community. The physical takeover of the office happened quietly but carried enormous weight. On a crisp morning, I met the board members and a locksmith of our choosing at the office building. Together we inventoried the contents, from dusty file cabinets filled with violation letters to boxes of unused envelopes and rubber stamps. We changed every lock, catalogued every record, and set up new procedures for digital backups. I walked through each room, remembering how Karen had sat behind that desk like a queen on her throne, slamming gavels and scribbling fines, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing her reign was truly over. The master key that once symbolized her power was now nothing but a broken piece of brass in an evidence bag, while the real keys jingled in my pocket, under lock and protocol that served everyone, not one tyrant. Of course, Karen still tried to stir the pot from the outside. She filed one more appeal, this time to the State Attorney General's office, claiming civil rights violations, but by then her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that her complaint was dismissed without review. Rumors circulated that her husband's security company lost several contracts after the audit findings went public, and some said they were facing bankruptcy. I didn't celebrate their misfortune, but I felt no pity either, because they had built their lives on exploiting others, and justice had finally caught up with them. Life at the lake transformed in subtle but profound ways. Residents who had once dreaded HOA notices now received newsletters about potlucks and fishing tournaments. The widow who had paid fines for her garden fixtures was reimbursed in full, with interest. The young couple threatened over kayaks tied to the shoreline now laughed as their children paddled freely, no clipboard-toting enforcers in sight. The office, once a place of dread, became a symbol of transparency, its door open during posted hours, a bulletin board outside displaying meeting agendas and financial summaries for anyone to read. Slowly, trust rebuilt itself, not because of me alone, but because the community finally had ownership of its own future. The final chapter of this story did not unfold with explosions or grand spectacles but with a slow, undeniable shift in the daily rhythm of life around the lake, a shift that revealed just how much damage Karen had done over the years and how much healing had begun since she was stripped of power. The once feared HOA office now stood as a transparent hub of community life, its bulletin board filled with notices about upcoming meetings, barbecue nights, and fishing tournaments rather than threatening fines and inspections. Residents wandered in freely during posted hours to ask questions, pay dues, or simply check the records, and they always left with a sense of calm rather than fear. I made sure of that because every ledger, every invoice, every decision was posted clearly for anyone to see. No one had to worry about secret votes or backroom deals anymore, and the relief that spread through the community was visible in the way people carried themselves, shoulders lighter, eyes brighter, laughter easier. It was in those simple moments that I realized the true victory wasn't just in taking the office but in giving the power back to everyone it had been stolen from. Karen, on the other hand, had dwindled into a shadow of her former self. After her public humiliation with the locksmith stunt and the failed appeals, she had retreated into near isolation. Her once constant emails and notices were replaced with bitter mutterings to the handful of loyalists who still entertained her complaints, but even they were drifting away as the evidence of her corruption continued to circulate. Her husband's security company folded under the weight of lost contracts and pending investigations, and whispers suggested they were selling off assets to cover debts. Every time I heard a new rumor, I didn't gloat, but I couldn't help feeling a quiet sense of justice, that the universe, or at least the law, had finally caught up with her. One of the most satisfying moments came months later when the county court sent out notices confirming restitution payments to dozens of residents who had been fined illegally under Karen's watch. I stood at the post office one afternoon watching neighbors open envelopes, some gasping, others laughing, as checks were pulled out, money that had been stolen from them returned with interest. An elderly widow clutched her check with tears in her eyes, whispering that she could finally replace her broken heater before winter. A young father grinned ear to ear, telling me the reimbursement would go toward his kids' school supplies. In those moments, I saw the real weight of what we had accomplished, not just the removal of a tyrant but the restoration of dignity and fairness to people who had felt powerless for too long. The new elections for the HOA board were a turning point as well. With the interim board stepping aside, the residents voted in a diverse group of neighbors, teachers, retirees, young parents, people with no interest in wielding power but with every interest in maintaining fairness. I declined a permanent seat, preferring to remain as custodian of the office and advisor rather than fall into the trappings of titles and politics. My role was to guard the foundation we had rebuilt and ensure no one ever tried to twist it into a weapon again. During the first official meeting of the new board, laughter echoed through the hall as neighbors debated ideas not about fines but about community gardens, holiday events, and ways to improve the lake's upkeep. It was the kind of meeting that would have made Karen seethe, and that thought alone made it sweeter. Karen did attempt one last desperate maneuver when she filed a personal lawsuit against me, accusing me of defamation and theft of office property. I appeared in court armed with the binder that had grown fat with every piece of evidence I had collected over the months. I laid out the master key incident, the padded invoices, the audit results, the easement filings, and the recall election records. Her claims unraveled under the weight of the truth, and the judge not only dismissed her case but also ordered her to pay legal fees. Watching her slump in her chair, defeated, her once fiery demeanor extinguished, I felt no triumph in the moment, only closure. She had built her entire identity on control, and when stripped of it, she had nothing left but bitterness. That was punishment enough. As time passed, Karen became a cautionary tale rather than a looming threat. New neighbors arriving at the lake would hear whispers about the Master Key Queen who had once tried to rule over the community with fear, and they would shake their heads in disbelief when told how she had fallen. Sometimes I would catch older residents telling the story to newcomers around campfires, embellishing details for dramatic flair, laughing about the night her key snapped in my lock or the day the locksmith refused to open the office for her. It became less of a bitter memory and more of a shared legend, a reminder of what the community had endured and how it had come together to overcome it. For me personally, the journey was transformative. I had started as a man simply trying to protect his cabin, his peace, and his property, but along the way I had become something more, a defender of fairness, a voice for those who felt silenced, a custodian of trust. I never sought power, but by wielding truth and persistence, I had dismantled a corrupt system and rebuilt it into something better. On quiet evenings by the lake, I often reflected on how it all began, with the sound of metal scraping against my lock in the dead of night and a broken key glittering on my doormat. That single mistake by Karen had opened the door to a chain of events that ended with her downfall and the rebirth of our community. One evening, months after the dust had fully settled, I stood outside the office at sunset, watching the golden light wash over the lake and listening to the laughter of children playing nearby. A group of neighbors gathered in front of the office, posting flyers for an upcoming barbecue, and one of them joked about how strange it felt to see that building used for something joyful rather than something threatening. I smiled and jingled the keys in my pocket, keys that no longer symbolized fear or abuse but responsibility and trust. Someone asked me if I planned to keep the keys forever, and I told them no, that one day the community itself would hold them collectively, because the true lesson of Karen's reign was that no one person should ever have that much unchecked power again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I took one last look at the office and thought about Karen, wherever she was, probably still grumbling about her lost throne. In the end, she had been undone not by violence or vengeance but by her own arrogance and my refusal to bend. The master key she once brandished as her symbol of authority had failed her on my cabin door, and from that failure had sprung a new era, one built not on fear but on unity. That was the real victory, the kind that lasts, the kind that no appeal or tantrum could ever erase.